Welcome to Military History Inside Out, a podcast devoted to the study of how war has been waged across the centuries. In today's podcast, I speak with Dr. Merv Roberts about his new book, The Psychological Warfare for Vietnam. Dr. Roberts is in the U.S. military and was inspired to write this book, to do this research, based on what he does or what he did in Afghanistan when he was deployed. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. I'm speaking with Dr. Merv Roberts, author of The Psychological Warfare for Vietnam. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
So tell me about your background in writing and in history.
My background in history, I had a BA in history back in the 80s, and just never really did much with it. I got out of college, went into the Army, really kind of forgot about it until after my first tour in Afghanistan. I came back, I realized I needed to up my game in terms of analysis and writing skills, so I went back for a master's degree, and one thing led to another, and ended up with this book there. It wasn't something I had planned for my whole life, it just happened that way. The result was the book.
Okay, so your thesis became the book, was the basis for it?
Right. Well, my thesis then fed directly into the dissertation, which is, fairly well revised, but became the book.
Mm-hmm. Where'd you get your PhD?
From University of North Texas, up in Denton, north of Dallas.
How did you choose Vietnam the Vietnam War as your dissertation?
That's a good question. And what had happened, I came back from Afghanistan. I was doing psychological operations there. And so I came back, I realized I needed to study more to understand psychological operations, how to do this stuff, because I was kind of a novice at it. So I decided to go on, get a master's degree, or start working towards a master's degree. And while I was taking some classes, one of the professors mentioned that the Texas Tech archives online had a lot of stuff, and maybe there'd be something worthwhile in there in terms of Psy Ops. I started digging and realized there is a whole lot of unexplored information in the archives on psychological operations, and that no study had been done of that stuff. There was no real overarching history of the Vietnam War psychological operations program. And so I realized I got kind of a background. Maybe I'm the guy who can do that, who can look at this information, and I will learn how to do this stuff in my own life, because I knew I'd be going back to Afghanistan again. And so that's kind of where it was. I looked at Vietnam. I said the Vietnam situation was very similar to what we were facing in Afghanistan, and maybe if I can learn what they did right and wrong there, it'll help me in Afghanistan.
I'll start asking you about details on the book itself. Are we talking about Army psychological operations or joint?
This is joint, and really the book looks at North Vietnam, looks at South Vietnam, looks a little bit at Korea and Australia, looks at the United States. It's really the interaction of all those programs that are going on. The thing about Psy Ops is it never happens in a vacuum. You have to look at all aspects, because one side's making a message, the other side has to react or try to find a way to counteract that message in some way. And so, yeah, it covers a pretty broad look at the psychological war in Vietnam.
So you look at operations by both sides then? Correct,
yeah. So I'm looking at, I used, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which was part of the basically associated with the CIA. They collected all radio broadcasts, open source, through most of the Cold War, and there's another name for the organization today, but they do the same thing. They capture everything that's out in the ether and transcribed it so that you could do open source analysis. And so in the Vietnam War, they captured, recorded, transcribed almost all radio broadcasts, and so you can go back and read the North Vietnamese broadcasts, you can read clandestine broadcasts, you can read the Chinese, all the propaganda that's going on out there. And so that's largely where the story of the North Vietnamese side comes from, that and captured documents.
Can you compare and contrast how each side approached psychological warfare?
In the book, I kind of go into the North Vietnamese program is really a derivative of the Soviet program. Ho Chi Minh was heavily involved in Comintern and developing and implementing Soviet propaganda in the 1930s, 1940s. And so the North Vietnamese program is heavily influenced by that program. It's a communist-based system. There is no absolute truth. It's about agitation and propaganda. You find that thing that somebody's upset about, and you just itch and itch and itch until you get the reaction, cause the anger that then you can utilize that anger for your own purposes. And so the propaganda side is making sure your cadre understand what the party line is at any given moment. A communist system that can constantly change. And so the North Vietnamese program is very much a derivative of that. And the American system is going to evolve over the course of the war. And they go there without a whole lot of knowledge in terms of practical knowledge of how to conduct psychological operations. They're going into a country that they don't really understand culturally. And it's a steep learning curve, I think, comes across in the book there. If you're going to try to figure out what was the American sort of approach to propaganda, it really comes out of our advertising culture here, right? And there's an assumption of you have to provide some level of truth. It's subjective truth. I don't want to say subjective truth, but you provide subjective truth, and you try to encourage people to join your side. You attract people to your side in that respect. So I guess maybe if you'd want to look at a key difference, on the one hand, much of what the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are going to do is it's a divisive, agitative propaganda meant to get the people to your side, either through causing fear or intimidation. There is some attempt in the early phase of the war, 1960, 63, at building a cause for the people to rally around, but it's a nationalist cause. The reality is it's a communist group, and they're not really interested in the things that they may be agitating for. Like the agitation is simply to cause anger so that you can divide people and rally that anger and direct it in a way that's going to be useful for your program.
I would think that the American approach, the Americans and their allies would have had two objectives: both keep the people on your side happy in a sense, and also agitate the other side, whereas it seems North Vietnam, really all they had to worry about is agitate the South. It seems like they wouldn't have to worry that much about their own population.
Well, they have problems in the North, and there's a division within North Vietnamese leadership over whether they should focus on South Vietnam or whether they should focus on building socialism in the North, right? And so Ho Chi Minh's on that North First faction. The leaders who are actually ruling the country, Le Duan and Le Duc Tho, they are focused on spreading the revolution to the South. And so there is a division there. Those two leaders, the two Le Duc Tho and Le Duan, they control the North, and they have to have a very repressive police state in order to keep those North First faction in check. And so in terms of the Psy war that we're conducting against the North, because there's a separate program of psychological warfare we're conducting against North Vietnam, and that is aimed at agitating them. So we are. I don't want to say we don't do any agitation on this. We are trying to divide those two factions. It's beginning by 1967, going to 68, to have some effect. And at the last minute, right after the Tet Offensive, we call off that. LBJ cancels basically all the Psy war against the North in return for negotiations with Hanoi. And so that was one of the requirements in North Vietnam, that we stopped that. and we shut down almost everything, all leaflet drops. We had a notional resistance movement up there to create fear on the part of the regime that they were being infiltrated by agents. We were sending agents. There's a lot of stuff going on up there to foment those divisions. And but at the moment when it might have paid off, we canceled it.
And I guess North Vietnam, they probably said they were slowing down on their own efforts, but what do you see? What did you see?
In terms of propaganda?
Yes.
They never stop. I mean, for them, it is an unending stream of propaganda and figuring out. In the South, their operations in the South by 1967 are pretty much falling on deaf ears. The South Vietnamese people understand that the propaganda line they're getting from the North is not accurate. The VC Viet Cong propaganda is not having a wide effect. People are not accepting that. They may not be loving the South Vietnamese government, but they are not in favor of the world that the VC and the North Vietnamese are presenting. 60 to 63, that might have been the case, right? There may have been some effect of that propaganda because they're offering a sense of hope. But by 65, 67, the amount of conflict and the fact that they could, the effect of the combat on the people, they're having to deal directly with the oppressive nature of Viet Cong in their villages, the forced conscription of their youth and younger youth, because people are not joining the BC. They're having an extremely tough time. They're having a hard time when you look at captured documents in terms of recruitment, desertion, morale problems within that organization, and so it is not functional in the South. On the other hand, their propaganda worldwide is very effective, and the effect, and it's really something I had not anticipated when I started to write this. I had no intention of writing at all about the anti-war movement and about the worldwide propaganda. I was just going to strictly look at what was going on in Vietnam. But you see increasingly after 65, the connections, very tight connections with the worldwide anti-war movement, specifically in America, the anti-war movement producing propaganda that's playing on Radio Hanoi, direct linkages on that. So that is a pretty successful program in North Vietnam. They're very successful at that.
So it seems that if the South Vietnamese population, it almost seems like they didn't even need psychological operations aimed at them if they figured it out themselves, the problems with North Vietnam. So, was the psychological operations, were they at all necessary then, in a sense,
And that's a question we asked the state, right? How do you measure the effectiveness? Did they learn the lesson? Because on the one hand, they're getting one story that does connect with the truth and the reality they see around them, and the other side, they can say that's a lie. Well, maybe they only understand that because you're telling them the story, but we have no way of proving that. I mean, and that's really a difficulty with psychological operations, and it's one of the things I get in the book is the attempts to figure out if it was even worth the effort, right? Were they having an effect? Because it's nebulous, right? Psychological operations, how do I prove this leaflet made this happen? It's a tough thing. I just believe from my own experience doing this stuff, there is a certain, there's an effect, and you can see, when you see it, you know it, right? You're like, yeah, I caused that, but I can't prove it, it's a art rather than a science in that respect. So that's a good question, though. How do we know if it did anything? I think you can look at some aspects. You can look at things like weapons turn-in programs. We had psychological programs, campaigns to encourage people to turn in weapons. Well, if people turn in weapons, there's an indication that messaging is working. It's helping people to understand what's going on. In the big scheme, though, Psy Ops is never going to just be the the panacea. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it gives the avenue for people to start thinking about things and start saying, wait, maybe I need to reevaluate what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so if you have that effect, maybe you've done something. A good example would be a surrender appeal. Mm-hmm. If I got some enemy out in the village, and they are, fighting, they're going to fight to the death. If I broadcast a loudspeaker message that gives them a way to live, and they choose that way to live, that's a pretty major impact. If they decide, hey, I'm going to surrender, but you have to give the messaging, and in the American and the South Vietnamese programs, that's what Psy Ops tended to be. Besides the psychological warfare against the North, which has that more agitative principle, most of the Psy Ops in the South is simply informational. I'm telling you about this school we're building. I'm telling you about this clinics or whatever that we have. I'm telling you about how to surrender. I'm telling you about how to get your uncle to surrender, and he will, be able to find a job in this new society. That sort of informational, and that's why I say it's more related to American advertising sort of culture than the stuff that the North is really focused on. Now, the Psy War against the North, that's a different program, right? It's run different organizations running that. And so that one, absolutely, that's a divisive, agitative propaganda program against the North. But most of what we're doing in the South is simply informational. And so I would say it is effective because you're giving people the idea, right, and let them run with it.
So this idea of providing information rather than propaganda makes me wonder about where do you divide civil affairs? I think in Vietnam they had civil affairs units.
Right.
Divide that between a psychological operations unit. How does that play out?
Okay. Today we have delineated very clearly civil affairs is one thing, Psy Ops is another thing. And so there's a tendency to say, well, civil affairs is all this, right? In Vietnam War, civil affairs was seen as an adjunct of the overall psychological program, right? We're going to build you this school. We're not building the school simply because we're nice guys. We're building the school because it's going to have a psychological effect. And there was an expectation that the two were in direct, maybe if you're a civil affairs guy, you want to say you're on top, right? But it was seen as part of a whole, right? The civil affairs is part of the psychological operation. It is meant to instill in the people a sense of the government's helping you out. We're the good guys. We're providing stuff. Whereas what does the enemy do? They take stuff from you. And so to build that psychological picture in people's minds. So in Vietnam, it is not seen as a separate thing. They are seen as directly working with each other. And, we're going to do a lot of stuff and help people out. Well, that has to have a psychological purpose to it. We are trying to encourage people to side with the government.
So what would you say is the main theme that you explore in the book?
The main theme is trying to analyze effectiveness, I think, is one of the main things I'm looking at, right? How do you analyze whether it had an effect? And the problem with Psy Ops, and that's why I have to go for 8 years, I really had wanted to cover the entire war, but it was getting too long. I cut it off some point. For Psy Ops, you really have to look at a long arc, because I might drop these leaflets here, and 2 years later the guy surrendered. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe he surrendered because of that program that's, was 2 years old. Mm-hmm. And so you have to look at that long arc to try to even begin to assess whether it was effective or not. And so in the end, my conclusion is there was a great deal of effectiveness by 67. Mm-hmm. Can I say the morale in the VC and the NVA units is dropping wholly because of the Psy Ops program? No, but it's a combination of the combat losses they're suffering in 67, and the Psy Ops, giving them a way out, telling them, presenting to them an alternative way of looking at things, those two things create that morale collapse.
Did you have many examples where you could you had one area in South Vietnam where there wasn't much Psy Op and another where there was, and you could maybe compare the effectiveness in that way?
That's one thing I want to explore further, and in fact, that's probably what I'm going to start doing this next fall. I'm trying to put together a class in which I will. We're going to do that level of analysis. Mine kind of looks countrywide. I look at documents that are captured throughout the country, though, and so it's more that more broad view. But the thing is, just my initial analysis. This is happening almost every place in terms of the VC difficulty in gaining supplies, gaining taxes, gaining recruits by the summer of '67. They're in a pretty tough position.
So among the Americans and their partner forces, were any of them particularly good at psychological operations?
Edward Landsdale, he goes there in the 1950s, is a guy who understood, I think, what had to be done and how to do it. And some of his proteges, Frank Scotton, who wrote a book on his experience there, understood how to work this thing. This was a program that had to be worked through the locals, right? No American can go to Vietnam and understand Vietnam like a Vietnamese can. And so you have to work through the local people. And so those are people who understood that. So, yeah, there are some people who I think are stars in this thing. But most of the, I don't go into a whole lot of names. This isn't a biographical, sketch. So I'm looking more at the data. I'm looking at the reports, and so I can't give in more detail on names. But those are a couple of, I would say, stand out. And on the correct approach for doing this stuff in a counterinsurgency type environment.
Are there any significant secondary issues you explore in the book?
Yeah, I mean, that attachment with the anti-war movement is, like I said, it was something I had no intention of even looking at. And as I started going through the North Vietnamese broadcasts and looking at more and more stuff, around that, I just realized how much of a linkage there was. I had no idea. And so then I had to go back and explore the anti-war movement here and look at the propaganda they're producing, and you see just a direct mirror image. They are parroting the North Vietnamese line, and they are influencing the North Vietnamese line. So it is a symbiotic relationship between the two organizations. Now, that's not to say everybody who was against the war was, a communist agent. I'm not trying to say that. But there were people in the movement who were key leaders who were absolutely directly linked with North Vietnam. And it goes back to that Soviet-style propaganda system. It's called agitation propaganda. And so it's a division of ideas. Agitation is, I'm scratching whatever anger you have, I'm going to scratch it to polarize the people and then try to use that sort of divide and conquer and get people on my side of the fence. So that's the agitation side. The propaganda side is messaging to cadre so that they know how to agitate at any given moment. And you see there are people, propagandists within the anti-war movement. They're the ones linked up with North Vietnam, and what are they doing at any given moment? Their messaging is based upon what's going to serve the North Vietnamese interests, and I'm going to agitate, whatever it is, right? Find the thing that those people are angry about at any given moment and agitate that thing. And try to propagate the party line that the North Vietnamese are favoring at that moment.
So it sounds like you're saying there were some people who were wittingly helping North Vietnam and others who just unwittingly went along, not realizing they were doing that.
The vast majority have no idea that this is happening, right? The vast majority, a lot of people, young people, upset about the war, various reasons, and, I don't want to fault them at all, right? But there are people in that movement who are purposely trying to agitate them, right? And giving them information for the purpose of making them more angry, so that they will follow their, and it goes back to another thing that the Soviets are really good at, which is the united front concept. We're going to create a front group. The front group is going to be controlled by the communists, right? That's under the Soviet system. You create a front, and Ho Chi Minh, that's what he did in the 20s and 30s, was, creating front groups. The front group is simply the facade for the core of, his communist group. So in China or, Siam or wherever else he goes to, you set up an organization that's the facade that's going to agitate and bring in dupes to help present an image of a mass organization, but it's really controlled by a core of ideologues who have a particular vision. And so I think you see the same thing in the anti-war movement to a degree. I don't want to. This is something I'm going to explore this summer. I'm going to do some research because I need to nail that down further before I say exactly delineate that. Right. But there is certainly linkages. I mean, there's no question on that. But I've got to do some more research to understand exactly how many of those people are, how exact-witting they were they, So there's a lot more to explore on that, and you could do an entire book, I think, simply on that.
What are some of the resources you use to do your research apart from what you've mentioned already?
Well, let's see. I mentioned the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is an untapped, largely resource for looking at anything in the Cold War. I mean, anything you want to look at for Cold War history, FIBIS, there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, it's just a daily transcript of everything that's on air, and you can go through. I've done some other research on the 1953 coup in Iran, so I was able to track all the messaging during that period of time. Wrote a paper for Journal of Iranian Studies on that, and I'm doing another one on Iran, because Iran's really kind of a secondary focus of my research. And so FIBIS was one. The other thing I did, and this is something that is really going to play out more, I'm hoping to do a second book, which will be 68 to 75, is the use of Geographic Information Systems software. It's a GIS. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. So during the war, they captured so much intelligence data that they did not have the computer processing power or software to analyze at the time. Robert McNamara was a data hound. He wanted every piece of data, right? Every spot bombs are being dropped, where shells are being dropped or shot from ships, where leaflets are being dropped. He wanted to know every, VC attack and what type of attack. I mean, he wanted everything. And so they collected massive amounts of data. And the computers in the 1960s really weren't up to doing the analysis. Well, what I had done, and it comes out in some of the book there, is import all this data, or many of the data sets, into ArcGIS, and then begin to analyze that stuff over time. And I'd become familiar with this when I was in Afghanistan, did some stuff with the ArcGIS, and I realized you start layering that data, stuff pops out that you never dreamed of before, right? It makes you ask the question about why is this anomaly happening here, right? It really brings into focus what is happening on the ground. And so I did some of that in this book towards the end, because most of the data really begins to pick up in terms of acquisition by 1967. But it's things like the Hamlet Evaluation Survey, which is often maligned by people, as a subjective analysis, and there is a lot of truth to that. You have to be careful with it. But this is a Hamlet level evaluation on about 18 different data points every month for the remainder of the war. That is an unheard of level of detail, I think, in any war. And even if it's not perfect, it is better than anything that probably ever has been collected in a war.
Right.
And so you can look at, it's subjective, right? It's an officer making an assessment. Is this village controlled by the VC? And then there's, like I said, about 18 different data points that he had to mark for that village on a given month. It's a perfect no. But when you look at it in the aggregate and you look at the trend lines, it gives you a pretty good picture of what's happening in the villages. And it may not be perfect, but you can look at it and say, wait, why are these villages becoming VC? Or is it really being VC? So then you can look at further data to assess the reality of that. But that's just one data point. Then you have terrorist incident reporting system, which is a collection of all propaganda that was reported through other systems, all assassinations, all everything, tax collection, whatever it is, right? So that's another data set. So you layer that on top of now Viet Cong initiated incidents. So anytime the VC initiated a combat operation, that was sent up through another data system, collected, and you can now transfer that into GIS. And when you start layering all these things, another one is Friendly Forces File, which has every battalion location on a monthly basis throughout almost the entire war. So now you can layer friendly forces on top of VC forces. When you start layering that all on top of each other, you can visualize the war in a way nobody could before, right? I mean, they couldn't do it in the Vietnam War, and until now, we haven't had the software and the ability. And so I've done some of that. The last couple chapters do some reference to a couple of maps I made on Quang Nam province to overlay a bunch of that data set, do some hotspot analysis so that you can kind of see where the main combat's occurring at that particular moment. So I'm looking at the lead-in to Tet Offensive in those maps. And this, to me, opens up huge opportunities for analysis for future historians. And so I'm really trying to push people to get into this GIS. And that's what I'm hoping to do in the fall is a class in which we will do a province-level analysis, right, of many of the provinces in the country using this data set over the course of about a 2-year period and looking at the data and then looking at captured documents because Texas Tech has I think the entire captured document exploitation center files now online available, so you can look at millions of captured documents, which was another thing that I used for this for the book here. You overlay all that stuff together, I think an entire new picture of the war is going to emerge out of that stuff.
So one thing you mentioned as far as data based on a psychological operations individual measuring things, I'd be curious to look at the training pipelines for the different people doing that and just see if in their training there were any biases introduced in how they measure things like that. That's a larger question, I guess. Yeah,
and that's that is really one of the things that got me interested in studying this. Because like I said, I was trying to study Vietnam to better understand how to do things in my own conflict in Afghanistan. And one of the problems is, how do you train a guy to do Psy Ops? As the book sort of points out, most of these guys aren't trained very well, right? And so it comes down to, do you have the right attitude to do this? If you're not the right person to do it, you're not going to try to figure out how to do it right. And so I think it's probably a mixed bag in terms of the American people who are doing Psy Ops. There's probably enough who are good, but they are not, for the most part, well trained. At points, only 50% of the officers had been to the Psy Ops school. The NCOs were military intelligence NCOs. They were not, there was no Psy Op MOS, and so they weren't trained in Psy Op. It's just, hey, I'm a military intelligence guy, and now I'm doing Psy Op. And so if you had the right attitude and thought about this stuff, maybe you would do it. And just off the top of my head, maybe that explains why Americans kind of fell into this advertising mode of Psy Ops, because that's what those people knew, right? That's the world they came out of, is advertising, and so they're thinking in those terms. So I don't, I'm not going to pretend to say here the Americans are great at Psy Ops, right? But when you look at the program and you look at over the time, was it effective? I think there is a strong case for an effective program. Definitely could have been better, right? And so there's lessons to be learned out of that.
What part of the research was most enjoyable?
Just going through all the captured documents was, to me, fascinating. Because there are just so many documents. They captured, millions and millions and millions of pages of documents, and most of them nobody ever saw. Or somebody saw them and gisted it, and then it just went into the pipeline and nobody ever looked at it again. And so going back and reading these and then getting a picture of what's going on in the BC units there, that was an eye-opening experience and pretty interesting.
So what did you find that was most surprising?
That linkage with the anti-war movement. I just did not expect that at all. I just planned to study tactical, psychological operations in Vietnam. That was my plan, and had no intention of looking at the anti-war movement, but it's unavoidable.
What was the most difficult thing to research? Maybe something that you eventually did get an answer for, or something that's still really you haven't gotten a handle on?
I'm not sure. There's a lot I'm still trying to figure out on this whole thing. And so I would say, ask me after I finish the next book. Because, as I said, Psy Op is a long-term arc, and there's still just a lot of questions. Was it effective? I have some indications that it's effective by 68. I really need to go further to say, yeah, this was an effective program. Here's the things they did right. Here's the things they did wrong. It's 8 years is too short a period to really answer that question. So that's the one thing I want to get a handle on the next set of research.
Are there any data sets that you know about that are lost, that were destroyed or something, or that you'll never get your hands on that would have helped?
Nah. Actually, there's probably too much data. There is so much between, those captured documents, the FIBIS stuff, obviously. The GIS data is an untapped resource. I scratched the surface. There are a few other historians kind of looking at this. I've worked with Australia, basically their National Defense University down there. They have an online program where they're beginning to put in some of this data to be able to go online and research this further. That is just, to me, that's going to be the answer to understand, at least on an operational level, what happened in the Vietnam War, because of the amount of data that's there. And so I don't think it's really a question of there's not something that may be lost. I think there's just so much that just hasn't been tapped into to really understand this war.
Do you think, are there resources in Vietnam that maybe you could tap into if you were able to link up with a Vietnamese historical researcher?
Yeah, there is and there are some people who speak Vietnamese, which I don't, who are doing some of that. Problem is, it's still a closed society, so there's limitations there. But, I was at a Texas Tech conference a year or so ago, and they pointed out that the Vietnamese military comes to Texas Tech when they want to research the Vietnam War, because they have so much stuff there. Just all these captured documents. We got documents they don't have, and so yeah. If you haven't been to the Texas Tech Vietnam Archive website, it is absolutely amazing in terms of the stuff that is in there.
So where's the FIBIS information? Where is that held?
That is more difficult to get to. What I had to do, some of it is on microfilm. And so I had to get the microfilm in and, just go through those endless reels, scan the pages that pertain to what I was looking at. Some of it is in book form, so I had to, interlibrary loan the books and go through those. That's a little more difficult. I haven't found an online version of that yet. There's no reason it shouldn't be, but I just haven't been able to find one.
Was there anything in your research that emotionally moved you, either in a positive or negative way?
Just reading some of the stuff, reading either the U.S. operational reports and some of this DC stuff, just gave me a strong sense of sadness for the Vietnamese people, right? Because most of the Vietnamese people are just wanting to live through this thing. They're farmers, they're out there, they don't want to, they're not necessarily ideological, wanting to choose one pole or the other, and they're caught in the middle of this thing. And that's typical in a counterinsurgency. I mean, Afghanistan's the same way. It's most people are just sitting there and they want to live their lives. And they're caught in this storm, and that storm sometimes forces them to make choices, and those choices can lead to deadly results. And so I think that I connected with just, again, because of my own experience in Afghanistan.
So did you find anything as far as psychological ops focused on Cambodia? Or
let's see, I don't go into Cambodia at all. Probably in the next phase of this book I would, because I've got a lot of documents related to that. There's going to be some clandestine radio systems that pop up in Cambodia, from both sides, and there is some stuff that happens there during this phase up to 68. I don't even touch Cambodia at all.
What do you hope the book will do for the study of Vietnamese war history?
Okay, in war history, I think this will help provide another overarching narrative of a one specific field within this war, right? We've got people who are looking at the strategic level decisions, LBJ and Nixon. We've had some tactical and operational histories, but this is a slice of the war that nobody else has really looked at. There's very little written on the psychological war, but to me, this is a major part of that war. It certainly was in terms of effort by the North Vietnamese. It has an effect in terms of their international program there. So hopefully this will provide another slice of the picture. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all. If you read this book, you know everything about the Vietnam War, but I think it provides another slice to better understand the war. For the field of psychological operations, I think this book probably should be read by anybody doing Psy Ops. There are very few books written on Psy Ops history, on any war, right? There's one or two on World War I. There's a couple of decent ones on World War II. In terms of the Vietnam War, there's one book that looks at a couple year slice, but it's not in one little attribute, one little organization. But there is no overarching look at the programs, what they were trying to achieve, and the battle between the various sides. And that's key to understanding how these programs were unfolding. So I think if for people doing that stuff, this will be invaluable in whatever operations they do in the future, whatever they're involved in.
I get the feeling that with psychological operations, with every war, the idea is, well, yes, we have to do something like this, but by the end of it, it's like you can't really measure how well it went, and so you just kind of throw your hands up and kind of brush it under the carpet and say, okay, well, next war we'll do it again and figure it out. It's a different culture. We'll just...
I think you're right. I think you kind of nailed it, because, you can say, man, we got to do something, on the one hand, some people are like very certain that, man, if we can just manipulate these people through PSYOP and make things happen, then we don't have to fight the war. There's all sorts of misconceptions, and you get these high hopes in the opening phase of the war, and then after a while, I think, like you said, it's like, how do we even know if this works, right? You can't prove it. It's very difficult to analyze and say, this leaflet caused this effect. Very difficult. And so that certainly happens at the end of the Vietnam War. There's no attempt. I don't want to say there's no attempt. Very little attempt, and there's no U.S. official history of the Psy Ops program. The BDM Corp was tasked with looking at the overall war. They looked at different aspects of the war, and one of them was psychological operations. So they did a kind of cursory analysis, but it really, when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But I think if I went back and read it now, I'd say, man, they missed everything. They really didn't do a very good job of analyzing this war. And so I think there is a tendency to get frustrated at the end, and then the next war comes along, and okay, we got to do something. That happens after World War I. World War I, hey, all sorts of propaganda. We create an organization in order to propaganda both Americans and the Germans. The war ends, and within 6 months they pretty much shut down the organization. And when we restart in going into World War II, there's nobody in service who had done Psy Ops before, or psychological operations. They bring in a guy who had done it in World War I, and basically he's just appalled because they hadn't learned any lessons in the 20 years after the war. They were just completely starting from scratch. And then we're a little bit better off when we go into Vietnam, because the Cold War, we had been doing some of this stuff, strategic, USIA, U.S. Information Agency programs. We'd had some elements of propaganda, but at the tactical level, they weren't ready for this. They got to completely create this system, grow it, and adapt it to the particular war. Yeah, and after the Vietnam War, we maintain a Psy Ops force through this whole thing. It does a lot of operations, and I would argue a lot of them, they do some pretty good stuff and have a pretty good effect. But again, it's always that question: how do you measure it? How do you figure out if it's worth doing it?
So the State Department seems like it's a good enduring capability as far as understanding how to do, to have a better idea. But I know that Defense and State Department don't really, in a sense, don't work well together in a wartime environment. Not as good as they could.
Right, yeah.
So I'm just curious if you came across anything about that relationship.
There is some problems amongst the various organizations on how they think they should approach it. I think the Army tends to have this can-do approach and just headlong, dash into operations. So there's some of that. I think some of it comes out in the book in terms of the CIA relationship with the military, and feeling, on the part of the military, the CIA just isn't up to the task of the psychological war against North Vietnam. The way it worked, the way the organization structure worked, though, for the military versus the State Department, was an organization was created, Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office, which was essentially over the messaging of the Army program. And so they provided the guidance for how the Army was going to attack any particular message, right? Ceasefire, bombing halt, whatever was going on. They provided the message guidance for the Army. Now, one question I would like to dig into more at some point is, how likely were the people on the ground to actually follow that guidance, right? And did they receive those guidances in a timely enough manner that they could then implement that guidance? So I don't have a good answer on that, how the implementation went, but in terms of the State Department, they had the primacy in terms of what the messaging and the direction was going to be.
Can you speak to any difficulties you had in getting the book published and how you overcame those?
Actually, it went really smooth, and because really I got to give my major professor, Dr. Robert Citino, huge credit for this. When I was writing the dissertation, he forced me to basically create a book, right? So it's the dissertation, but I wrote it as a book. And so that summer after I finished the dissertation, I put together a packet to, send off to a couple of publishers. Top of my list was University of Kansas, University Press at Kansas there, and they took it right away. So
Okay.
I think it was ready to go, but I got to thank Dr. Citino for making it that way.
Okay. Where can people find your work? The articles and also the book.
Well, the only article I've got published right now is in the Journal of Iranian Studies, 2012. I did an article on the coup in 1953 and the propaganda at that time. Mm-hmm. I'm working on a couple other journal articles right now, and the book is available at any place that sells books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any place like that.
Okay. Any final thoughts or words?
No, thank you for taking the time. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was good. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. One of the best ways to provide feedback on this podcast is to rate it on iTunes. Please let me know if you liked it, or give me a poor rating if you didn't like this podcast, and I can use that feedback to hopefully get better. Otherwise, please follow me on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, on Twitter at War Scholar, on Facebook under War Scholar, and you can find more information on my website, warscholar.org. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez. Thank you, and I hope you continue to enjoy this podcast.